Picture this. One morning, the United States wakes up to discover its electric vehicle factories are grinding to a halt. Military technology production? Frozen. The culprit isn't a cyber attack or a missile strike. It's something far more devastating. China just turned off the tap on materials America didn't even realize it desperately needed. And Washington is about to learn a brutal lesson. In modern warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't always a bomb. Sometimes, it's simply knowing which switch to flip. Act 1. The trap springs shut. This wasn't your grandfather's trade war. There were no dramatic announcements, no fiery speeches at the United Nations, no military posturing along contested borders. What happened was far more surgical and, honestly, infinitely more effective. Within a single business day, China made a decision that would expose the fragility of American industrial power. They restricted exports of lithium and essential battery components, the invisible backbone of everything from Tesla vehicles on California highways to F-35 fighter jets patrolling contested airspace. The call came before sunrise. The Treasury Secretary's voice was urgent as he briefed the White House on a crisis that couldn't wait for morning coffee. America's existing reserves of these critical materials? They'd run dry in less than a week. What followed wasn't chaos, it was something worse. The systematic unraveling of a narrative the American public had been sold for years. The promise of energy independence, the vision of a self-sufficient industrial base, the confidence that tariffs and tough talk could reshape global supply chains. All of it collapsed in real time, broadcast on cable news networks that struggled to explain what was actually happening. China didn't need to fire a shot. They simply stopped shipping. President Trump dismissed it publicly as political posturing, calling it theater designed to test American resolve. But inside the West Wing, his advisors understood something far more troubling. This wasn't a bluff. This was leverage of a kind no modern American administration had ever confronted. Here's the uncomfortable truth that had been hiding in plain sight. More than 80% of the components that power American electric vehicles come from China. This isn't speculation, it's documented fact. The International Energy Agency confirmed it in their 2024 comprehensive report on global battery supply chains. For years, policymakers promised that tariffs would break this dependency. They swore that economic pressure would force manufacturing back to American soil. But those tariffs ran headfirst into a problem they couldn't solve. China doesn't just sell these materials, they control them at every stage. From the mines where lithium is extracted, to the refineries where it's processed, to the sophisticated facilities where it's transformed into battery-grade components, Beijing had spent decades building an empire that couldn't be replicated overnight. The financial markets understood immediately. Within hours of the announcement, commodity traders drove lithium prices into five-figure territory per metric ton. Major investment banks issued emergency briefings warning clients that Western producers were still 3 to 5 years away from matching even a fraction of China's processing capacity. Government officials spoke confidently about backup plans and strategic reserves, but federal data told a starkly different story. Despite pouring tens of billions of dollars into domestic production initiatives, the United States produced less than 3% of global rare earth elements. And that specialized manganese required for advanced battery chemistry? America's domestic production? Zero. Mining projects that were supposed to change this equation remained trapped in regulatory limbo. In Nevada, Wyoming, and Montana, promising lithium deposits sat undeveloped, buried under environmental reviews and legal challenges. Industry forecasts suggested that meaningful domestic production wouldn't come online until at least 2028, maybe later. That left American automakers completely exposed. Even vehicles assembled in Michigan or Tennessee depended on Chinese batteries, Chinese cathodes, Chinese anodes. By the final quarter of 2025, China's official export statistics revealed something remarkable: rare earth shipments to the United States had dropped by nearly 40%, the steepest decline recorded in over a decade. Investigators traced the reduction to newly implemented permit requirements for manufacturers of rare earth magnets, those small but absolutely critical components found in everything from electric motors to guided missile systems. These weren't just commercial products anymore. These were materials that the Pentagon had classified as essential to national security. And now, their distribution was determined entirely by decisions made in Beijing. Act 2. The Pentagon realizes the danger. Inside the Department of Defense, alarm bells weren't just ringing, they were screaming. Contractors conducting routine inventory assessments made a disturbing discovery: stockpiles of critical magnetic materials, the kind used in advanced weapon systems, would last perhaps 4 months at current consumption rates. Maybe 6 if production was scaled back. Internal Pentagon assessments tried to project calm. The situation could be managed, they concluded, but only under one critical assumption: that current supply levels would remain stable. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong within weeks. But the impact wasn't limited to defense manufacturers and car companies. The shockwaves spread much faster and much wider than anyone anticipated. In America's agricultural heartland, farmers watched in disbelief as China abruptly canceled soybean purchases, redirecting billions of dollars in orders to suppliers in Brazil and Argentina instead. For the first time in nearly 20 years, official records showed 0 pending soybean sales to China. 0. The financial devastation was immediate. Billions in expected farm revenue simply vanished. Farmers who'd survived the previous trade war began drawing painful comparisons, and this time, many feared the damage would be worse. Why? Because this crisis was hitting at the worst possible moment economically. Interest rates had climbed to levels not seen in over 15 years, making it brutally expensive to borrow money for equipment, seed, or even to cover operating costs until the next harvest. Federal Reserve data painted a grim picture: debt service was now consuming a larger percentage of farm income than at any point in the past 2 decades. Farms that had weathered previous downturns on thin margins suddenly found themselves with no cushion left. Act 3. The strategy behind the chaos. Here's what makes this situation so fascinating from a strategic perspective. The entire rationale behind imposing new tariffs was to rebuild American manufacturing, to bring production jobs back home, to reduce dependence on foreign supply chains. But that strategy had a fatal flaw. It depended entirely on accessing raw materials that remained under Chinese control. By the spring of 2025, Beijing expanded its export restrictions even further, adding more rare earth elements to the controlled list, specifically those used in advanced weapon systems and precision manufacturing. The White House called it an act of desperation, evidence that pressure was working. Global investors saw something different. Capital flows, the ultimate truth teller in international economics, were moving toward Chinese markets, not away from them. This dominance wasn't accidental. Years earlier, China had formally designated magnet production as a strategic security industry, pouring state resources into companies that would come to control nearly 95% of global supply. Financial analysts compared this level of market control to the influence once wielded by nations that controlled reserve currencies. Meanwhile, President Trump floated the idea of doubling down, proposing tariffs as high as 100% on certain Chinese goods. Economists immediately warned of catastrophic consequences. Electric vehicle prices would skyrocket, potentially adding $20,000 to $30,000 to the cost of a typical EV. Consumer demand would collapse. The policy designed to protect American workers would function as a massive hidden tax on American families. While Washington debated tariff rates, Beijing was executing a completely different playbook. They continued locking down control of raw materials while simultaneously encouraging foreign manufacturers to build production facilities inside China's economic ecosystem. BYD, China's electric vehicle champion, surged past competitors, outproducing Tesla in quarterly output for the first time. And here's the brilliant part. BYD's factories outside of China, plants located in Thailand, Brazil, and Hungary, remained entirely dependent on battery materials sourced from Chinese suppliers. They'd effectively sidestepped Western trade barriers while maintaining complete supply chain control. The message was crystal clear. In this economic conflict, control of the supply chain mattered infinitely more than the size of any tariff. What began as a US-China confrontation rapidly evolved into something larger and, honestly, more concerning. By October 2025, European Union trade officials issued stark warnings. If China's export restrictions continued or expanded, Europe's defense manufacturing capacity could be reduced by up to 50%. Semiconductor production, critical for everything from smartphones to military communications, faced similar risks. This was no longer a bilateral dispute between Washington and Beijing. It had transformed into a global competition for control of the raw materials that will power the next century of technological development. Inside the American government, deep divisions emerged. Treasury Department officials advocated for restraint and diplomacy, believing that negotiation might prevent further escalation. The Commerce Department pushed for sustained pressure, arguing that only continued economic pain would force Chinese concessions. At the Pentagon, the conversation was more pragmatic and considerably darker. As one senior defense official told the Wall Street Journal in a rare moment of candor, money can be printed without limit. Critical metals cannot. Financial markets began watching something else entirely, something that received far less media attention but potentially carried more significance. Bloomberg analysts identified a subtle shift in how China was structuring its trade relationships, routing export revenues through Shanghai-based settlement systems denominated in yuan or even gold rather than US dollars. By anchoring trade to physical commodities instead of currency, Beijing was reducing its vulnerability to American financial sanctions while simultaneously creating a new form of economic leverage. The White House dismissed these observations as speculation and conspiracy theories, but industry data suggested otherwise. Volkswagen, Hyundai, and Toyota all reported delays of 6 to 8 months for essential battery components. Japan's Automotive Manufacturers Association issued a carefully worded statement confirming that global mineral supply chains remained, quote, subject to significant Chinese oversight, diplomatic language that barely concealed complete dependence. With midterm elections approaching and rural voters demanding action, Washington announced a $32 billion agricultural support package, echoing farm bailouts from the previous trade war. But this time, the math was considerably worse. Higher interest rates combined with expanded defense spending pushed Congressional Budget Office projections toward a staggering $2.4 trillion deficit by 2026. Then Beijing made another calculated move. In March 2025, Chinese authorities quietly stopped approving soybean exports from 3 major American agricultural firms, CHS, Louis Dreyfus, and EGT. The official explanation cited logistical complications and regulatory reviews. The unofficial message was unmistakable. This was economic leverage being applied ahead of a critical tariff decision. The impact in America's Midwest was swift and brutal. Soybean prices in Illinois dropped below the cost of production. Equipment purchases collapsed as farmers delayed or canceled orders. Fertilizer demand evaporated. Local banks, facing mounting agricultural loan defaults, suspended new lending to farmers altogether. This wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow, methodical squeeze. Chinese officials described the situation as routine market adjustment. The Financial Times was less diplomatic, publishing analysis that compared these agricultural restrictions to rare earth controls. Both demonstrated how economic dependencies could be weaponized without deploying a single soldier. President Trump appeared on television insisting that China needed American markets far more than America needed Chinese goods. But the actual trade data contradicted that claim entirely. In 2024, U.S. exports to China totaled $143 billion. Chinese exports to America? $439 billion. That 3-to-1 asymmetry meant Washington had far fewer cards to play than its rhetoric suggested. By mid-October, another disruption emerged. Chinese customs authorities began delaying shipments of specialized magnets destined for American defense contractors, citing incomplete documentation and paperwork irregularities. Reuters reported that suppliers were being asked to resubmit forms that had already been approved months earlier. It was a familiar pattern, bureaucratic delays that provided plausible deniability while achieving strategic objectives. European diplomats recognized the tactic immediately. China was following World Trade Organization rules to the letter, while quietly constricting supply through administrative procedures that were technically legal but practically devastating. Markets briefly rallied when President Trump suggested in an interview that neither he nor President Xi wanted economic contraction, sending the S&P 500 up 2% in a matter of hours. But notably, no actual restrictions were lifted. The National Security Council issued a statement saying all policy options remained under review, which analysts correctly interpreted as an admission that Washington had no clear solution. Observers in Shanghai identified a broader strategic pattern emerging. By tightening control over advanced battery technologies, China was ensuring that even manufacturing facilities located outside its borders remained dependent on Chinese intellectual property, Chinese technical expertise, and Chinese material inputs. Orano, France's state-backed mining company, confirmed that new licensing frameworks increasingly favored partners willing to align their production timelines with Beijing's strategic priorities. Collaboration was possible, but only within boundaries that China defined. Back in the United States, corporate warnings escalated. General Motors cautioned investors that material shortages could delay its next-generation battery platform by 18 to 24 months. Tesla postponed expansion plans for its Nevada Gigafactory, citing supply uncertainty. Ford suspended a joint battery venture with Chinese company CATL while awaiting regulatory clarity. Every single disruption traced back to export controls, originating in Beijing. Treasury Department economists calculated the cumulative economic impact. Disruptions across electric vehicles, agriculture, defense manufacturing, and related industries could reduce U.S. GDP growth by nearly 1 full percentage point in 2025, representing roughly $170 billion in lost economic output. The International Monetary Fund categorized the trend as a trade-induced economic slowdown, with potential to trigger broader recessionary conditions if left unresolved. Meanwhile, President Trump posted on social media claiming that China's economy was faltering and that Beijing would soon be forced to negotiate. The economic data suggested a very different reality. Chinese industrial production grew 6.3% year over year, while U.S. manufacturing output contracted by 1.7%, according to Federal Reserve tracking. China's economic challenges remain theoretical and projected. America's problems were measurable and present. While news cameras remained focused on press conferences and political theater, the real consequences were surfacing elsewhere. Delayed component shipments, unpaid agricultural loans entering default, factory assembly lines running at partial capacity or shutting down entirely. The narrative of American industrial self-sufficiency wasn't just being questioned. It was eroding in real time under the weight of mathematical reality. Then, late one evening, a Department of Energy assessment landed on key desks throughout Washington. The conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Projected U.S. battery supply chain independence by 2030 stood at 0%. Zero. Not low, not concerning. Zero. For years, The reality had been obscured by optimistic projections, political promises, and wishful thinking about the speed at which supply chains could be rebuilt. Now, that reality had become impossible to ignore. China hadn't won this confrontation through military strength or diplomatic brilliance. They won it decades ago by quietly securing control of resources that seemed boring and technical, the kind of things that don't make headlines until suddenly they're the only headlines that matter. While America debated tariff percentages and negotiating positions, Beijing was playing a completely different game. They understood something that Western policymakers are only now beginning to grasp. In the 21st century, power doesn't just flow from aircraft carriers and missile systems. It flows from whoever controls the materials that make those systems possible in the first place. And right now, that's not us. The question isn't whether America can eventually build domestic supply chains for critical materials. With enough time, investment, and political will, perhaps it can. The question is simpler and far more urgent. What happens in the years before that becomes reality? Because China already knows the answer, and they're betting we won't like it.